This happened only a couple of months ago, so I'm still quite on edge. I had a group of friends that lived about an hour and a half away from me, and I would frequently go hang out with them. The drive never really bothered me, but after this particular night, I dread it. I first noticed the car about 20 minutes into my trip home. It was about 2 a.m., so not many cars were on the road. This guy was practically riding my bumper, which I thought was strange because there were no other cars out. I quickly wrote it off and tuned back into my music. The time on the freeway is about 55 minutes, and he was behind me the entirety of it. When I saw he was getting off at the same exit, I got a little anxious, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. I was heading home as I normally would until I noticed that this car was making every turn right behind me. I started turning down random roads to test my theory of them following me, and just as I suspected, they were trailing behind. I stopped going towards my house and started driving randomly, trying to think of what to do. I tried whipping down roads at the last second, but that didn't work. I was driving through red lights and stop signs because I was scared of what would happen if I stopped. I was so desperate at this point, so I called the police and told them I was being followed for over an hour. I gave them a description of the car and my location. The dispatcher told me to drive to the police station and there would be officers waiting in the parking lot. As soon as I turned into the parking lot, the car sped off. One of the police cruisers immediately flipped on their lights and followed them. I stayed at the station and gave my statement, but I never got a call or anything like that. After that night, I only drive during the day. I don't want to know what would have happened if I were to go home. This happened to me 5 years ago when I was studying abroad in Italy. The school year had ended, so my friend and I, both women, decided to travel to the Italian seaside. We went to a really cool little city called Paestum. Creepy experience aside, a beautiful place to visit, and I recommend going there if you ever have the chance. After visiting the Greek ruins that stand there, we made our way to the beach to get some sun and relaxation. When we arrived, we passed by a group of 4 men. When we walked by them, they all stopped talking and stared at us as we went by. That was the last interaction we had with them, but it put us on edge. To get some space from them, we walked a fair distance until we found a nice private area. Aside from the group of men, my friend and I were the only 2 people on the beach. After tanning for not too long, maybe 15 minutes, I noticed a man walk down the shore in front of us, not from the group from before. He glanced up at us and kept walking. I didn't think anything of it until he turned back, walked past us again, and continued this for a while until he sat down about 10 feet in front of us, facing the beach. He could have sat anywhere else on the empty beach, but of course he decided to sit in front of us. My friend and I were both creeped out at this point, but hadn't been to the beach in months and decided to ignore him and hope that he goes away. We were too hopeful. Eventually he came up to us and started to speak to us in Italian. We pretended we couldn't understand him, so he continued in broken English. I told him to leave us alone, that we were not interested in talking to him. He started to walk away, but before leaving he took a photo of our butts on his phone. We had been lying on our stomachs and in bikinis. I jumped up and told him to delete it immediately, but he just hurried away and I didn't feel like chasing after the creep. I felt violated, but relieved he had left. After that, we were in a bad mood and decided to just give up on the beach. We walked back to the small town and went to a bar to have a drink. Once again, we were the only people, with the exception of a female bartender. Sitting on the patio, we finally started to relax when a disgusting-looking red sedan pulls up in front of the patio and sits there with the engine running. My friend and I look at each other, dread setting in. After a few minutes, the car pulls away and we hope it was just a random person. 5 minutes later, the car returns. This time, the window rolls down and the same man from the beach starts to shout something at us. My temper flared up and I shouted something stupid. All he did was laugh and then sped away. Not long after that, he returned and stared at us with the creepiest smile on his face. I got up and got the bartender. When he saw this, he drove away and didn't return. My friend and I wanted to just go back to our hotel at this point. The bartender asked us if we wanted her to walk us to the train station, a 30-minute walk through wheat fields over dirt roads. We declined, thinking he had been scared off and that we were okay to walk back. We were wrong. After walking down the quiet dirt road, we hear a car pull up behind us. We look back, and lo and behold, it was the red sedan. Not knowing what to do, we keep our eyes down as he followed us and just kept walking. Fortunately for us, a tourist bus drove down the road. In the sedan's attempt to avoid the bus, he accidentally sideswiped it and then zoomed off to avoid dealing with that situation. We were so happy to finally be rid of him. We walked another 10 minutes down the road when we start to approach a fork where we were going to turn left. On the fork to the right, there were a few trees and a shaded area underneath. As we got closer, we saw the red car parked under the trees facing our direction. My stomach dropped to my knees. He had been waiting for us, and now maybe blamed us for the accident. We didn't have anywhere to hide and nothing to protect ourselves with, and there was no reception to call for help. I remember the awful feeling when he pulled out of his spider hole and started driving down the road towards us. All of a sudden, another car came down the road from the opposite fork. Terrified and with no other options, we ran in front of the new car and started waving our arms for it to slow down. The driver stopped, and in our poor Italian, we asked for a help and a ride to the train station. The driver was the owner of a local hostel and gave us a ride back to the train station in the opposite direction he had been headed in. I don't know what higher power exists, if there even is one, but we were saved that day from something that could have been very bad. I was working register at a Dollar General at the time. I had a steady flow of customers, so I was fairly busy. One customer stepped up to the register and wanted to look at a portable AM/FM radio that was behind the counter. He was in his 20s, maybe early 30s, hard to tell because he was so rough looking. He had a tattoo on each cheek. He was acting really weird and obviously on something. He wanted to see what kind of batteries it took. He opened the package. He couldn't get the battery cover off because he would need a screwdriver, so he starts banging the thing on the counter and breaks the battery cover off. He asked me to help him figure out what batteries he needs. Meanwhile, I have a line building up and I can see the customer behind him looks nervous. I was very calm and patient with him because he made me nervous as well. I think that might have been what could have saved me from possibly ending up a victim myself. He eventually paid for the radio and left after me taping the back of it back on for him. After he left, me and the customer who was next talked about how uncomfortable the guy made us, and that was the last time I saw him, in person anyway. The next time I saw him was on Facebook, on a link to a news article. I can't remember if it was the same day I saw him or the following day that it had happened, but I saw his unmistakable face on the mugshots. He robbed and shot a local pizza delivery guy to death and then called 911. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. I honestly feel that if I had reacted or treated him differently, or if there weren't as many customers in my store at that time, I could have been a potential victim. He was so nervous and he was trying to stall at my register, which he did for about 15 minutes. I think he got spooked and changed his mind on robbing me. This story seems like the perfect place for one of my grandmother's "things were very different in the 50s" stories. This story is from her perspective of the event as she told to me. Some background information before we get into it. This was February of 1956. My grandma was 18 at the time and in her freshman year at a large, well-known state university in the Northeast Division of the Midwest in the United States. She describes this time in college as the most freedom she had ever had, even with very strict curfew for girls in particular, and an upsetting amount of racism and sexism that fueled school culture both from faculty and from students. The school also had a very secretive approach to matters of crime on campus. As my grandma said it, I was in my first few months of winter semester when I had come down with the Hong Kong flu that had been going around campus. I remember hating every second of it. especially because I had to get my first ever shot of penicillin. We had a lot more space on campus than there is now, so in order to prevent my roommate from getting sick, they had me boarding in the convalescent room that was on the first floor of my actual dorm room, only in a new wing that was still having the finishing touches added to it. I had unpacked my belongings for my stay until I was no longer contagious and decided to do some homework since my stomachache was keeping me up. From my room, I could see maintenance workers doing their jobs and getting the additional rooms ready due to the fact that the flu was running rapid on campus and there was going to be a greater need for convalescent rooms for students to recover in without getting others sick. I had been sitting at my desk doing homework with hair in curlers and in my jammy shirt and underwear. After a few hours of homework, I realized it was about 10, so I decided to get some rest and continue tomorrow. I'm not sure how long I was asleep, but out of nowhere my locked door was opened and the lights were turned on. I immediately woke up thinking that there was some sort of fire or campus emergency. I held the cover up to my chin, sitting up to see this man, who seemed to be in his late 40s, closing the door behind him as he walked in my room. As I heard the door shut and lock, I then realized that an emergency alert was not on this man's agenda for the night. I thought it was so odd that he had turned the lights on, because it allowed me to notice every single detail about this man. He walked towards me, putting his finger to his lips, which led me to notice how awful his complexion was and how bright red his hair color was. He was wearing a suede rust-colored bomber jacket and these green corduroy pants. As he was walking towards me, the only thought that could form in my brain was how I was not about to let this man see me in my jammy shirt and undies. He seemed to walk towards me in slow motion. As he got near me, I realized he was carrying an unusually sharp screwdriver with him. For some reason, in my panic state, all I could think about was him seeing me in my jammy shirt and underwear, so I decided to engage with this man. "What are you doing here? I'm very sick. You're going to get sick." "Just be quiet, you won't get hurt." At this point, he is right beside me in a twin-size bed, holding the screwdriver to my throat. I held the covers as close to my face as possible because, my jammies. I kept going on about my Hong Kong flu, saying that he was going to get sick, when all of a sudden he snapped at me, pushing harder into my neck with his screwdriver. He interrupted my speech on contagious airborne illnesses with a harsh, "Shut up, you stupid little girl. Be quiet and let me see your body." I don't know why, but for some reason I decided to stay on course with my original strategy of not screaming, but instead just talking his ear off about all the different ways he could be getting sick right now and how that would be such a shame. He looked at me with this puzzled look on his face as to why I wasn't letting him get a single word in of his shut-up interjections, regardless of how many times he threatened me. I then noticed his grip on me began to slowly loosen, and he eventually made his way walking backwards before dashing out of my room. I knew for a fact that I had heard him exit through the fire door next to me, but found it odd that the alarm hadn't gone off. At that moment, the seriousness of the situation flooded me and I burst into tears, running and screaming towards the RA who had been napping in the office. From there, the campus police were called, but because of their blatant disregard for my account of the events, they told me I was being hysterical and that it was only a bad dream. As soon as I told them that he had escaped through the fire door, but the alarm hadn't gone off, my story was chalked up to me being over-emotional over a bad dream. I didn't expect to hear anything else regarding this, and I hadn't told my parents out of fear that they wouldn't let me finish for my degree. They were never happy about me attending college because they felt that they were spending money for me to just become a housewife. However, about a week later, I had a campus police come to me asking me to come with them. I had no idea why they needed me and hardly spoke to me the entire time. All they told me to do was walk up to a bench full of men, identify the one that I had dreamt about, and leave. It wasn't until nearly a year later that I found out what that was. Apparently, a week later, a young woman had been found dead, assaulted and covered in stab wounds specifically around her neck. Me identifying my dream assailant was the confirmation they needed to link him to her murder. This man had been a hired electrician for the school's new building's wings, so he had access to the keys of the newly renovated room I had been in, which explained how he got into my locked room, This also explained how he was able to exit the fire door with no alarm sounding. I'm guessing he did what electricians do and found a way to disarm it. I was left in the dark about all of this and only found out from begging my RA to explain at least some details regarding the case. All I know now is that this man was found guilty and was sent to the state hospital for the criminally insane. I know nothing else. Looking back, I guess I was lucky that, in the moment, my only concern was that I didn't want this man to see me in my jammies. Because had I recognized the real danger I was in, who knows how I would have reacted or how he would respond. Anyways, my grandma was unable to answer any more questions regarding the details of what happened to him because the school was very strict about keeping this quiet. They didn't want the word getting around that it was someone they had hired. They did their best to handle this as secretively as possible so that other students or parents weren't alarmed, and my grandma was sent on her way, never really informed on the case after this, and was never updated on the whereabouts of her little visitor for the remainder of her time at the university. I had a closing shift tonight, so I had to take the last bus home. When I got off, I usually cut through a train station that is right in front of my apartment complex. Usually, there's no one waiting on the track because the last trains come at 9 p.m., but tonight there are two men who were just talking and smoking. I paid them no mind and walked faster than I usually did. If I had taken another way, the street would have been way darker and it would have taken a lot longer to get home. While I was walking, I was on the phone with my significant other and didn't notice anyone around me as my part of the street had no lights, so the only ones visible were the lamps in my apartment complex. As I get into the walkway, I saw a shadow behind me and assumed that it was someone else who lived in the same complex. I usually bump into neighbors who also have closing shifts on Wednesdays, so I kept going until I reached my doorstep and turned around to get my keys from my backpack. When I did, there was this tall, skinny guy from the train station wearing all black with a bike asking me if I was single. I was still on the phone with my significant other and said no. "Do you have a boyfriend? Are there any female friends you don't like?" I said no and quickly got my keys and opened the front door and closed it as fast as I could and ran upstairs. I'm checking to see if anyone is still downstairs from my balcony, but so far I don't see anyone. I'm still a little shaken up and I'm going to talk to my GM tomorrow about letting me work during the days from here on out. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Saturday, a week before sophomore year when this all went down. I was walking along the sidewalk with my best friend. My twin brother was biking beside us trying to perfect a wheelie. I know it wasn't smart to be outside this late without an adult or a car, but it was a relatively safe neighborhood and my brother was always equipped with a knife. The only bad thing I remember ever happening was a bank getting robbed a few years back. Curfew wasn't until midnight, which was getting closer, so we decided on staying out until then. We'd just be a street away from where my house was. The street we were on was the main road and the only people that had driven past so far were teenagers. My best friend and I sat on a bench outside a bar and restaurant that was closed for the night while my brother was doing wheelies all the way down the street and back. He had gotten really good at doing tricks on that bike. Me, on the other hand, had asthma and got out of breath from going upstairs. Now, my best friend hadn't had many great experiences with law enforcement, so when a police car drove past us slowly, she rolled her eyes and said he probably thought we were smoking. She was right. Most of the kids where we lived were getting caught smoking almost daily. The officer continued past us and stopped a good amount of way up the road. He was still in sight, but far. As teenager girls do, we were talking about all the guys she liked. I brought up my brother since they used to date in the past. "Would you ever go out with him again?" I asked, expecting a no or an ooh. She hesitated before answering with a yes. I was full of disgust and excitement all at once while I followed up with an explosion of questions. Meanwhile, my brother had gotten closer and eventually stopped in front of us to brag about his best wheelie yet. His rant was cut short when a small silver car drove past. An old man with what looked like a gray mullet and a red shirt yelled out his window, "Hey, hotties." He turned right at the intersection and out of sight. His voice had sounded weirdly high-pitched, as if he was purposely trying to sound creepy. I stayed quiet, refusing to entertain him. My brother, being the idiot he was, gave a loud hello, and my friend did the same. I asked if they had heard what he said, and my brother nodded. My friend had only heard the word hi and got angry when I told her about the extra word in that sentence. She went off for a minute about how it was disgusting for an older man to say that to two teenage girls. After she was done, I remember jokingly saying, "Watch him come back." Oh, and that he did. Minutes had gone by and my brother was down the road when the same man in the silver car came by again on the opposite side of the road. His window was still down, but this time he said nothing. His smile said everything for him. Too shocked to speak, I waited until he passed the police officer and went right down a different road that could lead him exactly back to where we were. From far off, I could see his car signal. He was turning onto the road to come back towards us. On top of that smile and the fact that he was to come back, my stomach dropped, but I didn't move. My friend, on the other hand, jumped up and started bawling. Her crying surprised me because of the fact that I didn't have a lot of feelings. It's hard to explain, but long ago I was prescribed pills by a doctor that had somehow blocked me from feeling certain bad feelings. I usually don't feel sad or embarrassed, even if I should. Seeing her crying, I finally moved and stood in front of her. I wasn't sure what to say, but my brother sped back towards us to see what had happened. I looked to my left to see if the officer was still around. He had left and the silver car was about to get closer. I tried to get out as much comforting words as possible while pushing her towards the nearest alley that led to my house. We needed to get off of that main road before he saw where we were going. Soon enough, I got them both down the alley where we hid behind a wall and paused. From where we were, we could see my house. If we ran straight for about a few parking lot lengths, then we'd be there. We listened as a few more cars passed, and I remember thinking he saw us running and knew to drive down the alley. Lucky for us, nothing happened, and the minute it was quiet, we booked it. My brother made sure to ride behind us until we got to the house. Everything happened so quickly. He fumbled for his keys as my friend and I glanced back at the main road a few times. The last time I looked was when I was standing in the doorway. That was the last time I saw him. I wasn't sure if he ever saw me, but if he did, he now knows where I live. I work part-time at the only grocery store in the town, and when I think of it, I try to look out for a customer that might match his description. About 3 months ago, my wife, then fiancé, and I were driving from Oregon to Arizona. We were in a part of Nevada that was in the middle of nowhere. We were on the end of a 70-mile stretch with no cell service, and it was midnight. My wife is a small girl, only 5'1", 100 pounds. I often joke when I go to see her at work, "Oh, it must be take your child to work day. She's that small." It was my wife's turn to drive at this point, so I reclined in my seat, out of view, sleeping. She shakes me awake and says, "This guy's been following me for quite a while. I don't know what this issue is." I glance behind us to see this big F-350 only about 10 feet behind us. I tell her to speed up, figuring he was just wanting to go faster, but he keeps the same distance from us. All of a sudden, he shoots into the oncoming lane, overtakes us, and proceeds to slow in front of us, bringing his and our speed to only about 10 miles an hour. She backs off a considerable distance when he slams on his brakes and starts opening his door. At this point, I sit all the way up. I'm a pretty big guy and roll my window down. He spots me, slams his door shut, and takes off. I'm not one to jump to conclusions, but I feel that if he didn't see me, he would have definitely tried to take my wife. It shook us up pretty bad, and at the next gas station we found, the attendant called it in. Luckily, I got his plate numbers, and that's why you don't drive in the middle of nowhere alone in the middle of the night. You never know who's out there. I'm a 25-year-old male. When I was younger, my dad would tell me this story about something that happened to him and my older brother when my brother was very young. I have never had a reason to doubt that this was true, but you know how it is. You remember something from your childhood, and so you dig a little deeper. I independently researched this when I was older, and it's completely true. I'm happy to provide evidence to the mods if need be. The story went something like this. My aunt had just been physically abused by her husband at the time, so my older sister, an infant at the time, and my mom, pregnant with me, were with her. My brother was around 5 and stayed with my dad, who decided to take him camping on the Appalachian Trail as a special treat. My dad worked in law enforcement at the time, which ties back into the story. Where I live, there are multiple roads that access the Appalachian Trail, so my dad took my brother to a portion of the trail that leads to a trail shelter no more than 2 miles in. When the two of them arrived at the campsite, they decided to leave the shelter vacant and pitch a tent, as is polite to do for through hikers. There was one other camper near the shelter, which is not all that uncommon, given how close the shelter was to the road. My dad decided to introduce himself to the other, single male camper, mentioning that he works in law enforcement. The guy was clearly off, but as of yet was in no way nefarious towards them. He did, however, have a very large hunting knife that he left out clearly visible. As it began to get darker, the other camper began to behave more strangely. He would look over at my dad and brother and stare, as if he had something to say, and then look back. My dad did everything he could to engage the guy in conversation, but, again, the man just behaved oddly. My dad picked up on this, so decided to pull out his concealed weapon and place it within view. After about 2 hours of staring and creeping, the guy approaches my dad with a smaller hunting knife, not threatening, but as if to give it as a present. My dad naturally looks at this gesture with confusion. The man says, "Hey, take this." My dad says no. "No, really, take this." My dad insists no. A few more rounds of this back and forth. I mean it. Take this knife. You're gonna need it tonight." The guy says, deadpan, locking eyes with my dad. My dad doesn't know what to say, but the guy walks away and leaves the smaller knife by the fire ring. My dad has my brother, a young child, with him and is naturally terrified. He decides that, despite it being dark, it is high time to promptly get out of that camping site immediately. So with my brother close by, he packs up the tent and packs his pack. This takes about a half hour in the dark. My dad is about to leave, but the guy sees them. He picks up his hunting knife, holding it as if to attack, and approaches my dad. My dad has his flashlight pointed directly at the guy, sensing that something was about to go down. "I want you to fight me," the guy growls, locking eyes with about 10 feet between him and my dad and brother. My dad grabs his gun, aims it, and basically tells the guy to step down. He tells my brother to grab the pack, which had a seat on it to hold a young child. My dad puts the pack on. He hands my brother the flashlight and tells him to get on his back. At first, he backs up the trail with the gun trained on the guy and my brother pointing the flashlight at him. The guy slowly approaches but then stops just before my dad shoots. My dad decides he is going to run and tells my brother to shine the flashlight on the trail and let him know if he sees anyone follow, clearly dangerous in the near dark on a wooded trail, but it was that or leave my brother with no light. My dad runs all the way back to the car, hightails it out of there, and goes home to call my mom and put my brother in bed. He also calls the cops. The next day, my dad hears that the guy went to a bar after the encounter and started talking about it. He then, oddly enough, went to the cops to say that my dad had assaulted him with a gun, at which point the police got him for questioning. Upon follow-up and investigation over a few months, they found out that the guy was bipolar and wasn't on his meds, and didn't actually mean my dad or brother any harm. When the guy saw my dad's gun and heard he was in law enforcement, he decided that he basically wanted to end his own life by law enforcement. My dad went through a lot of counseling for this afterwards, which was always interesting to hear because when you hear these dangerous stories from people, you never hear about the aftermath. Thankfully, the guy wound up in jail for a short period of time. This happened when I was 5 or 6 years old. One night I was sleeping upstairs along with my younger sister who was an infant. My parents were downstairs hanging out and watching TV. There's a knock at our door with my stepfather going towards the door. He looks through the peephole to see a guy on the other side of the door. One of them asks, "Where's Maria?" We don't know a Maria. My stepfather tells him that no one named Maria lives here. The guy keeps banging on the door looking for Maria. My mother says that someone is trying to open our side door. As it turns out, this guy brought a friend with him. My stepfather retrieves his gun and pumps it so the guy outside knows he's armed. Eventually, these two guys leave and my parents call the police to report the incident. A few weeks later, the police update us on this case that they had found these two guys and arrested them. Sadly, these guys found Maria and her boyfriend, to which they ended both of their lives. Luckily, I was asleep during this event, so I only heard about it years later. This is the only seriously scary event to occur in my life, so I'm fortunate that they were not able to get inside our house. All I really recall of this guy was he had a lazy eye and was dressed pretty dirty and wore old torn-up plaid with long hair and seemed to be in his mid-30s. The encounter lasted about an hour. I was in a small town, 800 people in the winter, close to 2,000 in the summer, as it's a tourist town in southern Montana next to Yellowstone. We had about 1,000 guests in town at any one time, and I was in the middle of my second year living there alone, no family. By now I knew everyone. They all knew me and was on the tail end of a crisis where I had to learn how to be a person from being introverted, shy, and sheltered, so I felt as if though I owned the town. On my way to the bar, I was crossing the bridge at around 11 p.m. and forgot a lighter. I saw a guy across the street sparking one up and called over if I could have a light. I was about to cross over if he said yes when he came over to me, which was a little unnecessary, I felt, but not weird. He gave me a light and began to talk at about a mile a minute, asking me questions without listening to the answer. I felt inclined to listen, as he obviously had a lot to say, and he gave me a light. It was only polite, and I was about being friendly back then. And it's important to note I didn't really have a danger radar. I can read people pretty well, and if I get a bad vibe, I back out, but I never felt afraid of anyone or anything, except wild animals, because I just lost everything and didn't have much to live for. I got the back out vibe, but listened, and for around 45 minutes, he talked more and kept me verbally trapped because I didn't want to be rude or make him mad, as he seemed a little volatile in spite of saying I needed to go meet people. The thing was, I didn't actually know if the bar was opened. It was the fall, and they closed when it got slow, which some days was 2 a.m., others 10 p.m. I could see the smoking deck, but no one was outside for any of it, which was weird, as 80% of the people seemed to smoke in that town, and if it was open, the deck was usually packed. He talked all about how he was on a trip with his dad, and because his mom had just passed away, and went into that. When he asked why I was in the town, I said I lived there because I too had just lost my mom and needed to sort my life out. He berated me for talking about depressing things and how it wasn't attractive to talk about that sort of thing, which was really hypocritical, as he had spent a good while talking about the same situation in that tone that was looking for pity or validation or whatever, whereas I just stated it as a fact. I was pretty numb to it still. He asked more personal questions. I answered some, others I ignored. He asked if I smoked. I did back then. He asked if I had any. I said no. I did, but I lied, and if I wanted to go smoke, where we could smoke. From our side, it was pretty easy to go under the bridge or down the alley on the far side of the bar. Everyone did that, but I wasn't about to because my mind was telling me to absolutely not be alone with this guy somewhere more private. He didn't know this town. He had no idea that no cars would pass by till morning, so he didn't get weird, but verbally he kept putting me down when I spoke, saying things that were obviously pity ploys, you know, the kind to make girls feel bad and be nicer, but got visibly annoyed when I didn't show much sympathy past what would be normal. He kept trying to get me to go somewhere with him, somewhere private, anywhere private, and I was like, no, happy to be here, thanks. He kept putting my intelligence down and telling me how he knew so much more than me, and that I was a baby and hadn't seen or done anything and I should listen to him. I would have chalked that up to it just being the way he was, but how he said it unsettled me. Real grooming questions and tones I've heard from people that ended up screwing over my friends before, putting them down, making them doubt themselves and swoop in like a guardian. I didn't like that, but I wasn't sure how to leave because by now, when I was telling him I was going, he seemed to want to follow me, and if the bar was closed, there was a lot of dark places and no one lived on that end of the bridge. I was absolutely thinking I needed out. Everything was closed and I had bad knees, so I couldn't even run from him. I was starting to worry a bit as he was getting more and more insistent to go somewhere with him and was slowly getting bolder in my space with what he said as we hadn't seen anyone, trying to convince me to go somewhere secluded. He also said that he had to pee, so I came up with a plan. I told him we could go under the bridge and walked over the large rock fall that everyone climbed up and down to go there, made of large boulders. It was a climb, but one even I could make and had many times with groups of friends. He climbed down first after some goading to make him go before me. He tried to get me to go first to show him it could be done. As soon as he was at the bottom, he asked if I was coming. I literally bolted out of there, and I went to the bar. They were too close together, so I would check both and make a beeline for the housing not too far off, where I had a smoking buddy if they were closed. Plus side, it was open, and I knew everyone inside. I told them about the weird guy, and I walked with them back across town when they were done partying to my house, which was right on the road, and I also lived alone. My closest neighbor was an elderly, nearly deaf man. I knew if I wailed my lungs out, someone would eventually come, but so many people got drunk and shout or scream, no one would come very fast, and he probably would have stopped me by then. Plus, I was a fair fighter due to daily sparring with my closest friend in town. It would have been a lot more frightening if I wasn't so up on myself about being able to take him in spite of the height difference. And truth be told, I probably wouldn't have stood a chance. I didn't even have a phone. The more I look back on it, the more frightening the experience becomes, especially because of how stupid I was ignoring all of those obvious red flags of danger. People get assaulted all the time in the towns around Yellowstone. One of my friends was stalked, and in one of the other towns it's just flat out dangerous late at night when drunk guys looking to have a fun holiday start to roam. I knew of 7 assaults that were never followed up on by police in the other town because 1, they had little info on the guys who did it and they had likely left town, and 2, it was the sort of small town where cops did what they wanted and it would look really bad or potentially ruin the entire town if it got out girls were being assaulted, as it was a 100% tourist-based town. Thankfully, the sheriff in my town was good, but he was across town that night at the last of the 4 bars, which was always open till about 2. I rarely went because elk had been camping out that season between my house and there, and elk 100% did frighten me. A few weeks ago, Labor Day weekend, my boyfriend and I made the journey to go see my grandparents, who live in rural Arkansas. It's beautiful up there, and we wanted to spend some time with them and go hiking, kayaking. The trip was going normally until our second night there. When we got there, my grandfather had mentioned something about a guy in his early 30s wandering around the road that they lived on, and how he'd never seen him before. They live in a small town, if you want to even call it a town, so everyone knows everyone. Like I said, they are in rural Arkansas in the middle of completely nowhere. They live on a mountain. Technically, it's a few hundred feet short of a mountain, but you get the idea. There's a shoddy cell reception, like an hour-and-a-half drive from the nearest Walmart, and a ton of wild animals, not to mention difficult terrain. It was our second night there, and we were all playing cards in their basement. The entrance to the house is on technically the second floor. That's important in a second. It's about 8:30, which is the equivalent to about 1 a.m. to my grandparents and the elderly people who lived around them, when we hear a knock at the door. My grandfather goes upstairs to answer the door, confused as to who is there that late, old people time, and all we hear is him say, "Didn't you just knock on my door?" followed by some talking. He comes back downstairs and we ask who it was. He says he doesn't know, but it looked like the guy who had been walking around in the woods a few days earlier. We asked him what he wanted and told us the man introduced himself with his full name and said he was trying to get his life back on track, was living with his mother up the hill. Where he said he was living was over an hour walk up the mountain. It was getting dark and you don't want to wander at night there, and he was just ringing doorbells. My grandfather said he was shirtless and seemed a little off. We were all a little wary, and my boyfriend mentioned something about burglars knocking on doors to see who was home so they can rob them. Seeing how a lot of people have vacation homes up there, we started getting nervous, but continued playing cards. About 20 minutes later, my grandmother and I meet eyes. She looked at me and goes, "Do you hear talking?" I said I did, but it was probably the TV. She looked a little freaked out and told me the TV wasn't on. My grandfather and boyfriend bowled up. My boyfriend goes outside and my grandfather pulls a pistol out of literally nowhere and follows him. My grandmother and I just stared at each other and went upstairs to see if we could see anything out the windows. They both come back in a few minutes and say they couldn't find anything. I'm freaking out at this point and asked what the name he gave was so I could Google him. When I did, not one but 2 missing person reports came up about him within the past year. One of them was found last summer when he was filed as a missing person with his girlfriend and her kid. They ended up being found, but they didn't know where Crazy Man was, but suspected he was lying low because of a police chase he had gotten in. The other one was from a few weeks ago, and his mother, who lives 4 hours away, not down the road like he said, had filed for him. My grandfather called the sheriff, and they ended up finding him still shirtless, running through the woods in the dark. I've been a nurse for 7 years. I absolutely love it. Back when I was in school, besides your clinicals where you did a rotation in every unit, such as labor and delivery, psych, etc., you had a month-long unpaid internship if you passed your exams and were slated for graduation. The internships were given out by the head instructor and it went alphabetically. My last name ends in T, so I was at the tail end. All the internships I wanted, emergency, med-surg, etc., they had been taken. The instructor told me, "Hey, we have a psych internship at a major psychiatric facility. You're a big strapping guy, I'm sure you'll be perfect." Great. Psych. I wasn't thrilled. I had no interest in psych, but I needed the hours to graduate, and I figured I'd have stories to tell my buddies over some beer. I had no idea. The hospital I interned at is quite well known, so I'm not going to go into many specifics, but it has a psych ward that deals with many different psychiatric disorders. There's a few floors. They had a rehab as well as a clinic for eating disorders. The floor I was assigned to was the children's psychiatric ward, so children 18 and under with all kinds of issues. Since I was not licensed yet, I didn't distribute medication or really anything to do besides work as a glorified orderly. Some of the kids were awesome. They had severe autism or other issues, but they were still great kids. Then there was Adam. He was diagnosed with RAD, as well as a bevy of psychological issues. He was 10 and tried to kill his 6-year-old sister, punched his mom so hard he knocked her unconscious, killed the family's cat, among other things. He was not allowed general access, not allowed to do craft hour, access to scissors. He was allowed an hour of free time where I or another staff member brought him to a small atrium where he'd run in circles or kick a half-deflated soccer ball. Well, one day it's raining and the atrium is a no-go, so I was told I could let him in a small nurse's lounge. The charge nurse swore she removed any weapons he could have used. So I brought him in there, and while he sat at the corner and talked to himself, I sat in a chair and waited. I got radioed from an orderly, so I take my eyes off of Adam for a millisecond, and the next thing I know, a chair is violently launched at me. It hits me square in the face and I go down. I was stunned, not knocked out, and suddenly there's a 10-year-old, 80-pound kid on top of me, hell-bent on killing me. Luckily, he was easily distracted, and at the exact moment the charge nurse came in the lounge, probably to get coffee, I was able to flip him over and get him subdued. The charge nurse almost wets herself, then starts apologizing. I ended up with a broken nose and bruises. The head nurse was slapped on the wrists and my butt was kissed the next 2 weeks. Surprisingly, besides Adam and a few others, that place made such an impact on me after I graduated and became certified, I ended up working there for 4 years. So I have many more stories from my time there. Last I heard, Adam was in a long-term facility and with medications. I hope he's doing okay. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. Special thanks to IC Marina for her amazing art on today's thumbnail. Be sure to follow her on Instagram, links down below. Also, if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, /letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear it featured on the channel. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt.com. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.